in the deepest laboratories concealed beneath the towering Himalayan peaks of ancient Terra, the Emperor of mankind, master of humanity, architect of the future, embarked upon perhaps the most audacious genetic engineering project in the entire span of human history. Drawing upon sciences that bordered on the mystical, technologies that predated the dark age of technology, he crafted 20 genetically perfected sons from his own divine essence. These were to be the Primarchs, demigod generals who would lead humanity's expansion across the galaxy during the late 30th and early 31st millennia, in what would become known as the Great Crusade. The Emperor's vision was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Each Primarch was designed to embody specific aspects of warfare, leadership, and human potential, magnified beyond mortal comprehension. They were not merely enhanced humans, but living weapons of conquest. Each one was capable of commanding vast armies and bringing entire star systems into imperial compliance through force of will, tactical genius, and superhuman capability. The genetic template from which they were forged contained fragments of the Emperor's own psychic might, his tactical brilliance, and his unwavering determination to unite humanity under a single banner. The laboratory complex where this monumental work took place stretched for kilometers beneath the Terran surface, its sterile corridors humming with the energy of arcane machinery. Vast gestation chambers lined the walls, each one designed to nurture a developing Primarch through the carefully orchestrated stages of accelerated growth. The Emperor himself oversaw every aspect of the process, his golden form moving between the chambers as he monitored the progress of his sons with the attention of both creator and father. Tech adepts from Mars worked alongside the most brilliant geneticists Terra could offer, their augmented minds struggling to comprehend the full implications of what they were creating. Each Primarch was intended to serve as the genetic foundation for an entire legion of space marines. The Astartes gene seed would be derived from their Primarch's genetic template, creating a direct biological link between the superhuman generals and their transhuman warriors. This connection would ensure absolute loyalty and tactical coordination on a scale never before achieved in human warfare. The Emperor envisioned his sons leading from the front, their mere presence inspiring their legions to acts of heroism that would echo through the ages. The catastrophe that befell this grand design came without warning, and from a source the Emperor had perhaps underestimated. The Chaos Gods, those malevolent entities that dwelt within the roiling depths of the warp, recognized the threat that 20 unified Primarchs would pose to their eternal schemes. In a coordinated assault that transcended physical reality, they struck at the very heart of the Emperor's project. While the Primarchs were still in their infant stages of development, the attack manifested as a warp storm of unprecedented fury, its psychic winds tearing through the barriers between reality and the immaterium. The carefully controlled environment of the gestation chambers was shattered in moments as chaotic energies poured through dimensional rifts. The infant Primarchs, still developing within their protective cocoons, were caught in the maelstrom and scattered across the galaxy like leaves in a hurricane. Their gestation pods, designed to withstand the rigors of accelerated growth, became impromptu spacecraft as they were hurled through the warp to distant worlds. The Emperor's rage at this cosmic theft was terrible to behold. His psychic scream of fury reportedly shattered every piece of glass within 100 kilometers of the laboratory complex. The carefully orchestrated timeline of the Great Crusade was thrown into chaos, and the Emperor was forced to begin his conquest of the galaxy with only the Thunder Warriors and the nascent Space Marine Legions, lacking the leadership of his intended generals. Yet the scattering was not total destruction. The Chaos Gods, in their infinite malice, had not sought to simply destroy the Primarchs, but to corrupt them, to turn the Emperor's greatest weapons against him. This required that the infant demigods survive their journeys through the warp, landing on worlds where they could grow to maturity under circumstances that might make them susceptible to the dark influences of chaos. Some worlds were chosen for their brutal environments that would forge warriors of uncompromising violence. Others were selected for their political complexities that would teach the growing Primarchs the arts of manipulation and potential betrayal. The systematic rediscovery of the Primarchs became one of the defining aspects of the Great Crusade, as the Emperor's forces pushed outward from Terra, conquering system after system in human ID's name. They followed psychic traces and genetic resonances that led them to the scattered suns. Each rediscovery was a moment of triumph and trepidation, as the Emperor was reunited with his creations, while simultaneously learning how their experiences on alien worlds had shaped their personalities and capabilities. The first Primarch to be found was Horus on the world of Cethonia, a mining planet where the infant had grown to become a charismatic gang leader. His reunion with the Emperor was marked by immediate recognition and acceptance, setting the template for how other discoveries would unfold. Lion El'Jonson was found on the death world of Caliban, where he had become a knight protector fighting against the planet's monstrous inhabitants. Fulgrim was discovered on Chemos, where his perfectionist nature had transformed a dying industrial world into a paradise of artistic and technical achievement. Each reunion followed a similar pattern. The Emperor would arrive in the system, his psychic presence immediately recognizable to his son, despite decades of separation. The Primarch would typically be found in a position of leadership or prominence on their adoptive world, their superhuman capabilities having inevitably elevated them above their mortal peers. The meeting between father and son was invariably emotional, though the specific nature of that emotion varied greatly depending on the Primarch's experiences and personality. Lemon Russ was found on the ice world of Fenris, where he had become a legendary warrior king among the planet's feudal tribes. His reunion with the Emperor involved a drinking contest and a wrestling match, establishing a relationship built on mutual respect and shared appreciation for direct action. Rogal Dorn was discovered on the ice planet of Inwit, where his methodical nature had made him the architect of the planet's greatest fortress cities. His acceptance of the Emperor's authority was immediate and absolute, reflecting the disciplined mindset that would make him the master of siege warfare. Conrad Kerr's discovery on the crime-ridden world of Nostromo revealed the darker possibilities inherent in the Primarch project. The Night Haunter, as he had become known, had used terror and violence to impose order on his world's criminal underworld. His methods were effective but brutal, foreshadowing the psychological instability that would later consume him entirely. The Emperor's reaction to finding this particular son was notably more subdued than his joy at other reunions. The process of rediscovery was not merely about locating the Primarchs, but also about integrating them into the Imperial war machine. Each found son was given command of the Space Marine Legion created from his genetic template, transforming scattered companies of warriors into cohesive fighting forces led by their genetic progenitor. The Primarchs brought with them the tactical doctrines and cultural practices of their adoptive worlds, creating distinct identities for each legion that would persist throughout the Great Crusade and beyond. Ferrus Manus was found on Medusa, where his hands had been transformed into living metal through contact with a worm he had slain. His reunion with the Emperor led to the creation of the Iron Hands Legion, warriors who shared their Primarch's fascination with replacing flesh with mechanical augmentation. Vulcan was discovered on Nocturne, where his compassionate nature and skill as a smith had made him a beloved figure among the planet's population. His legion, the Salamanders, would become known for their protective instincts toward human civilians and their mastery of flame-based weaponry. The rediscovery process revealed the full scope of the Chaos God's manipulation. Some Primarchs had been placed on worlds that would enhance their loyalty to the Emperor and humanity, while others had been corrupted by environments designed to foster the very traits that would eventually lead them to betrayal. Magnus, the Red, was found on Prospero, where his psychic abilities had been nurtured and expanded, making him a powerful ally, but also dangerously susceptible to the temptations of forbidden knowledge. Angron was discovered on Nuceria, where his empathic abilities had been surgically removed and replaced with the butcher's nails, cybernetic implants that drove him into perpetual rage. By the time the Great Crusade reached its zenith, 18 of the 20 Primarchs had been found and integrated into the Imperial war effort. Their combined might had conquered thousands of worlds and brought countless human populations back into the fold of a unified species. The Space Marine Legions had grown to unprecedented size and effectiveness under their leadership, each one reflecting the particular strengths and characteristics of their genetic father. Yet 2 Primarchs remained forever lost to history. The Second and 11th Legions had been created alongside their brothers, their genetic templates carefully crafted by the Emperor's own hand. Their infant forms had been scattered along with the others during the Chaos God's assault on the Terran laboratories. Unlike their 18 brothers, however, these 2 were never found by Imperial forces, or if they were discovered, their fate was deemed so terrible that all records of their existence were systematically purged from Imperial archives. The deliberate suppression of all records regarding the Second and 11th Legions represents one of the most comprehensive acts of censorship in human history. By direct Imperial decree, every mention of these 2 lost sons was removed from official documents, their names struck from the rolls of honor, and their very existence denied. The remaining Primarchs were forbidden from speaking of their missing brothers, a prohibition that was enforced with such severity that even the most rebellious among them dared not violate it. This systematic erasure extended to every level of Imperial society. The Space Marines who had once served in these legions were either executed, mind-wiped, or redistributed among other legions, with their memories altered to remove any trace of their original allegiance. The worlds they had conquered were reassigned in other legion records, their liberation attributed to different forces entirely. Even the gene seed repositories that would have contained samples from these Primarchs were destroyed, ensuring that no future attempt could be made to recreate what had been lost. The thoroughness of this suppression suggests that whatever fate befell the Second and 11th Primarchs was considered so dangerous or shameful that even acknowledging their existence posed a threat to the Imperial cause. Some whispered theories suggested that they had fallen to chaos corruption so complete that their very names had become weapons of the dark gods. Others proposed that they had committed acts of such horrific magnitude that their punishment required the complete erasure of their legacy from human memory. The remaining Primarchs' reactions to this enforced silence varied according to their personalities and relationships with their lost brothers. Some, like Rogal Dorn, accepted the decree with stoic resignation, understanding that the Emperor's judgment was final and absolute. Others, particularly those with more questioning natures, struggled with the imposed amnesia, but ultimately submitted to their father's will. The psychological impact of losing 2 brothers and being forbidden to mourn them properly would contribute to the tensions that eventually erupted during the Horus Heresy. The empty spaces left by the missing Primarchs became a constant reminder of the Great Crusade's hidden tragedy. When the Primarchs gathered for councils of war or ceremonial occasions, 2 seats remained perpetually vacant, their absence more noticeable than any presence could have been. The numbering system of the legions preserved the memory of loss, with the 2nd and 11th position serving as silent monuments to whatever catastrophe had befallen their occupants. The legion numbering system, an administrative erasure. The official Imperial designation system for the Space Marine Legions followed a numerical sequence that reflected their order of creation in the Emperor's laboratories beneath the Himalayan peaks. Each legion bore a number from 1 through 20, corresponding to the genetic template of their Primarch progenitor. This numbering system was not merely administrative convenience, but represented the fundamental organizational structure of the Astartes forces. During the Great Crusade, the 1st Legion became the Dark Angels, the 3rd Legion the Emperor's Children, the Fifth Legion the White Scars, and so forth through the sequence that would define humanity's greatest military expansion. Within this carefully ordered system, two numbers became sources of profound unease among Imperial administrators and Space Marine commanders alike. The Second and 11th positions in the sequence were not simply vacant, but actively avoided in official documentation. Unlike the other 18 legions, whose heraldry, battle honors, and genetic lineages were meticulously recorded and celebrated, these two designations existed as deliberate absences in the Imperial record. The numbering system itself preserved their memory through omission, creating gaps that drew attention precisely because they were meant to be ignored. The retirement of these legion numbers from active service represented an unprecedented act of institutional amnesia. Imperial scribes working in the vast archives of Terra received explicit instructions to skip from the First Legion directly to the Third when compiling organizational charts, treating the missing designation as though it had never existed. Similarly, documentation proceeding from the 10th Legion would jump immediately to the 12th, leaving no trace of what should have occupied the intervening space. This systematic gap in the numerical sequence created an eerie consistency across thousands of documents, each one bearing the same deliberate omission. The administrative machinery required to maintain this fiction was staggering in its complexity. Every organizational chart, every strategic planning document, every ceremonial roster had to be carefully vetted to ensure that no reference to the missing legions remained. Imperial bureaucrats developed elaborate cross-referencing systems to track and eliminate any surviving mentions of the 2nd and 11th designations. The administratum's most trusted scribes were tasked with reviewing historical documents and systematically removing or altering any passages that might reference the lost legions, replacing them with carefully crafted alternatives that maintained narrative continuity while erasing the forbidden subjects entirely. Evidence of the missing Primarchs' existence persisted despite these efforts, hidden within fragmentary references that escaped the purges or were deemed too obscure to warrant attention. Horus Heresy-era documentation occasionally contained oblique references to the Lost Ones, or those who came before the storm, phrases that meant nothing to casual readers, but carried profound significance for those who understood their true meaning. Strategic planning documents from the early Great Crusade sometimes contained mathematical discrepancies that only made sense when accounting for forces that were no longer officially acknowledged to exist. The most compelling evidence appeared in the form of incomplete Space Marine Legion organizational charts recovered from the archives of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet. These documents, dating from the early decades of the Great Crusade, contained detailed breakdowns of Legion strength, deployment patterns, and command structures for all 20 original legions. The charts showed clear organizational frameworks for the 2nd and 11th Legions, complete with estimated troop strengths, specialist unit compositions, and projected expansion rates. The data suggested that both legions had been developing along standard patterns before their sudden disappearance from Imperial records. These organizational charts revealed that the 2nd Legion had been designated for rapid assault operations, with an emphasis on mobility and shock tactics that distinguished them from their more specialized brethren. Their theoretical structure included unusually large numbers of jump, pack-equipped assault marines and fast attack vehicles, suggesting a doctrine built around swift, decisive strikes against enemy positions. The 11th Legion's organizational pattern indicated a focus on siege warfare and defensive operations, with heavy weapons companies and fortification specialists comprising a significant portion of their projected strength. The systematic removal of heraldry belonging to the missing legions required extraordinary measures that extended far beyond simple document alteration. Imperial monuments across hundreds of worlds had been constructed during the Great Crusade to honor the achievements of the Space Marine Legions, featuring elaborate displays of Legion symbols, battle honors, and commemorative artwork. The purging of the Second and 11th Legion symbols from these monuments involved teams of skilled artisans who worked under the strictest security protocols to physically alter stone carvings, metal inlays, and painted murals. On Terra itself, the Great Triumphal Way featured massive stone pylons bearing the heraldic devices of all 20 legions, each one carved with exquisite detail by the finest craftsmen in the Imperium. The pylons representing the Second and 11th Legions were not simply destroyed, but carefully reworked to display abstract geometric patterns that maintained the aesthetic balance of the monument while eliminating any trace of their original purpose. The skill required for this work was extraordinary, as the alterations had to appear natural and intentional rather than obvious attempts at concealment. Similar modifications were made to the Hall of Victories in the Imperial Palace, where banners and trophies from every Legion's campaigns had been displayed in a vast gallery celebrating humanity's expansion across the galaxy. The sections dedicated to the Second and 11th Legions were transformed into memorial spaces honoring unnamed heroes of the Great Crusade, their original contents replaced with generic symbols of imperial unity and conquest. The curators responsible for these changes were sworn to secrecy under pain of death, their work conducted in absolute isolation from the rest of the palace staff. The genetic legacy of the missing Primarchs presented the most complex challenge for Imperial censors. Unlike heraldry or battle records, which could be physically altered or destroyed, the genetic templates of the Second and 11th Primarchs existed in multiple forms across the Imperium. Gene seed repositories on dozens of worlds contained samples from these legions, carefully preserved for future Space Marine recruitment and research purposes. The systematic destruction of these genetic archives required the deployment of specialized Mechanicum teams equipped with the most sophisticated data purging equipment available. The process of genetic erasure extended to the Space Marines themselves. Warriors who had served in the Second and 11th Legions possessed genetic modifications derived from their Primarchs, templates, making them living repositories of forbidden knowledge. Imperial records from this period contain cryptic references to genetic reconciliation procedures and template harmonization protocols, suggesting that surviving Legion members underwent extensive biological modification to remove traces of their original genetic heritage. The psychological impact of these procedures was reportedly severe, with many subjects experiencing memory fragmentation and identity confusion. Theoretical estimations of Legion strength during the period before their disappearance can be derived from contemporary organizational models and recruitment patterns observed in other legions. The standard legion structure during the early Great Crusade typically comprised between 80,000 and 120,000 Space Marines, organized into chapters, companies, and specialized units according to their particular tactical doctrines. The Second Legion, based on fragmentary evidence from organizational charts, appeared to be developing toward the higher end of this range, with projected strength estimates approaching 100,000 warriors at full deployment. The 11th Legion's theoretical strength was more difficult to determine due to the specialized nature of their siege warfare focus. Legions that emphasized heavy weapons and defensive operations typically maintained smaller overall numbers, but with higher concentrations of specialized equipment and support personnel. Estimates suggest that the 11th Legion might have numbered between 70,000 and 90,000 Space Marines, with a significant portion of their strength concentrated in Devastator squads, heavy weapon companies, and engineering units capable of constructing and maintaining complex fortifications. Recruitment World Analysis provides additional insight into the potential scope of the missing Legion's operations. Each Legion typically maintained recruitment rights over multiple worlds, creating a network of human populations specifically cultivated to produce suitable candidates for Space Marine transformation. The Second Legion's emphasis on rapid assault tactics would have required recruitment from worlds that produced individuals with exceptional reflexes, spatial awareness, and aggressive temperaments. Death worlds with high-gravity environments or planets with complex three-dimensional terrain would have been ideal sources for such recruits. The 11th Legion's focus on siege warfare and defensive operations would have necessitated recruitment from worlds that emphasized discipline, technical aptitude, and psychological resilience. Forge worlds with strong mechanicum presence or civilized worlds with advanced engineering traditions would have provided the most suitable candidates for transformation into siege specialists. The systematic erasure of these recruitment networks would have required the reassignment of entire planetary populations to other legions, a logistical undertaking of staggering complexity. Evidence suggests that both missing legions had begun establishing their characteristic recruitment patterns before their disappearance. Fragmentary records from the Adeptus Administratum indicate that specific worlds had been designated as primary recruitment sources for the Second and 11th Legions, with infrastructure development and population screening programs already underway. The sudden termination of these programs would have left thousands of potential recruits in administrative limbo, their destinies abruptly redirected to other legions without explanation. The impact of losing two entire legions extended beyond simple numerical reduction in Imperial military strength. The specialized capabilities that each legion was developing represented unique tactical approaches that could not be easily replicated by their surviving brothers. The Second Legion's rapid assault doctrine might have proven crucial in campaigns where speed and surprise were essential, while the 11th Legion's siege expertise could have shortened numerous protracted conflicts during the Great Crusade's expansion phase. The redistribution of surviving personnel from the missing legions created subtle but significant changes in the composition of other legions. Warriors with specialized training in rapid assault techniques were absorbed into legions with different tactical doctrines, potentially diluting their unique skills while introducing foreign elements into established unit cultures. Similarly, siege warfare specialists found themselves integrated into legions that might not fully appreciate or utilize their particular expertise, representing a permanent loss of institutional knowledge and capability. The psychological impact on the remaining Primarchs of losing two brothers was profound and lasting. The enforced silence surrounding the fate of the Second and 11th Primarchs created an atmosphere of unspoken dread that permeated every gathering of the Emperor's sons. The empty chairs at council meetings served as constant reminders that even the Emperor's most favored creations were not immune to some terrible fate that remained too dangerous to acknowledge or discuss. The Word-Bearer's Legion possessed a unique relationship with forbidden knowledge that predated their fall to chaos by decades. Even during the height of the Great Crusade, when they still professed loyalty to the Emperor's vision of imperial truth, the 17th Legion maintained extensive archives of religious texts, philosophical treatises, and historical documents that other legions would have considered heretical or irrelevant. This scholarly tradition, inherited from their Primarch Lorgar's deep fascination with matters of faith and cosmic truth, positioned the Word-Bearers as inadvertent custodians of information that the Imperium sought to suppress. Lorgar Aurelian's approach to knowledge differed fundamentally from his brother's more pragmatic perspectives. Where Robot Guilliman collected information to improve administrative efficiency and Perturabo gathered data to enhance his siege craft, Lorgar pursued understanding for its own sake, driven by an insatiable hunger to comprehend the deeper meanings behind existence itself. This philosophical inclination led him to preserve documents and testimonies that other Primarchs would have dismissed as irrelevant speculation, creating a vast repository of potentially dangerous information within the Word-Bearer's fortress monastery on Colchis. The Primarch's private study within the Tower of Silence contained thousands of texts that had been collected from conquered worlds throughout the Great Crusade. Ancient religious manuscripts, philosophical treatises from lost human civilizations, and even Xeno's documents that had been translated by the Legion's scholar marines filled the chamber's towering shelves. Among these accumulated writings were fragmentary references to events and individuals that officially no longer existed, preserved not through deliberate defiance of imperial censorship, but through Lorger's compulsive need to understand the full scope of human history and divine purpose. During the early decades of the Great Crusade, before the Emperor's censure at Monarchia had begun Lorger's transformation into a servant of the Dark Gods, the word-bearer's Primarch engaged in extensive correspondence with his brothers regarding matters of philosophy, theology, and the nature of their shared destiny. These private communications, conducted through encrypted astropathic channels or delivered by trusted courier serfs, revealed a side of Lorger that his public persona as the Emperor's most devoted son had concealed. In these intimate exchanges, he demonstrated a profound awareness of gaps in the official narrative of the Great Crusade that troubled his deeply analytical mind. Correspondence recovered from the personal archives of Fulgrim contained several references to conversations with Lorger regarding what the word-bearer's Primarch termed the arithmetic of brotherhood. In one particularly revealing exchange, Lorger had questioned why the Emperor's grand design required exactly 18 legions when the theoretical framework of the Great Crusade seemed to suggest a more complete organizational structure. His mathematical mind had identified patterns in legion deployment and specialization that implied the existence of additional forces, whose absence created tactical and strategic gaps in the imperial war machine. These observations were not mere academic curiosity, but reflected Lorger's genuine concern for the completeness of the Emperor's vision. The word-bearer's Primarch possessed an almost supernatural ability to perceive underlying patterns and hidden connections, a gift that made him invaluable as a philosopher and theologian, but also dangerously perceptive regarding matters that were meant to remain concealed. His letters to Perturabo contained detailed analyses of siege warfare doctrines that referenced tactical approaches no existing legion had developed, suggesting knowledge of military traditions that had been systematically erased from imperial records. Lorger's theological insights. The most significant evidence of Lorger's awareness of the missing Primarchs appeared in his theological W.R. Ittings, particularly in the extensive commentaries he produced on the nature of divine will and cosmic purpose. These texts, written in the flowing script of ancient Colchision and intended for private study rather than public distribution, contained numerous references to the broken circle of brotherhood and the wounds in the Emperor's grand design. The language was sufficiently metaphorical to avoid direct violation of imperial censorship, but the underlying meaning was clear to those who understood the context of his concerns. In one particularly revealing passage from his treatise on the nature of divine sacrifice, Lorger wrote extensively about the concept of necessary loss in the pursuit of greater purpose. He theorized that the Emperor's ascension to godhood required the sacrifice of elements that were too pure or too dangerous to survive the transformation, comparing this process to the refinement of precious metals through fire. The text contained oblique references to the first offerings and those who walked ahead into darkness, phrases that carried profound significance for readers who understood their true meaning. The word-bearers' role as keepers of forbidden knowledge extended beyond their Primarch's personal interests to encompass the Legion's entire institutional culture. The 17th Legion maintained a complex hierarchy of chaplains, apostles, and dark apostles who served not only as spiritual guides, but as living repositories of information that other legions would have considered too dangerous to preserve. These warrior priests possessed extensive knowledge of pre-imperial human civilizations, Xeno's cultures, and the esoteric philosophies that had shaped human development across the galaxy. First Chaplain Erebus, even before his complete corruption by the powers of chaos, demonstrated an unsettling familiarity with events and individuals that should have been beyond his knowledge. His conversations with other Legion officers and visiting dignitaries contained casual references to historical precedents and tactical doctrines that implied access to information sources not available to other Imperial forces. The chaplain's extensive personal library contained documents that had supposedly been destroyed during the early phases of the Great Crusade, preserved through the word-bearer's systematic collection of religious and philosophical texts. Erebus possessed a particular fascination with the concept of martyrdom and divine sacrifice, themes that appeared repeatedly in his sermons and private writings. His theological treatises contained detailed analyses of historical figures who had been deliberately erased from imperial records, individuals whose sacrifices had supposedly been necessary for the advancement of human civilization. The chaplain's writings suggested that he understood these erasures not as punishments for failure, but as necessary components of a larger cosmic plan that required the removal of certain elements to achieve its ultimate purpose. Kor Pharon, Lorgar's adoptive father and the most senior member of the Word-Bearer's command structure, possessed an even more extensive knowledge of forbidden subjects than his nominal subordinates. His position as the Primarch's closest advisor and spiritual mentor had granted him access to information that was denied to other Legion officers, including details about the early years of the Great Crusade that had been systematically suppressed in official records. The elderly warrior's conversations with trusted subordinates contained references to events and individuals that predated the establishment of current Imperial censorship protocols. The former priest of the Covenant demonstrated a disturbing awareness of the political and military factors that had shaped the early development of the Space Marine Legions. His private discussions with other Word-Bearer's officers revealed knowledge of organizational changes and strategic realignments that had occurred during the first decades of the Great Crusade, modifications that officially had been attributed to natural evolution of Imperial military doctrine, but which Kor Pharon understood to have more sinister explanations. His insights into the true nature of these changes suggested access to information sources that extended far beyond normal intelligence channels. Kor Pharon's theological writings contained extensive discussions of the concept of divine judgment and the necessity of removing impure elements from sacred institutions. His treatises on the nature of spiritual corruption included detailed analyses of historical cases where entire organizations had been dissolved or transformed to prevent the spread of dangerous influences. The language he employed was sufficiently abstract to avoid direct violation of imperial censorship, but the underlying themes clearly referenced events that had been systematically erased from official records. The Word-Bearer's collection of Colchision, religious texts provided another avenue for preserving forbidden knowledge in forms that escaped imperial censorship. The ancient religious traditions of Colchis contained numerous references to cosmic cycles, divine judgment, and the necessity of sacrifice in the pursuit of spiritual advancement. These themes, when interpreted through the lens of the Word-Bearer's extensive knowledge of imperial history, provided a framework for understanding events that could not be discussed directly without violating censorship protocols. The Chronicle of Divine Ascension, one of the most significant religious texts preserved in the Word-Bearer's archives, contained passages that could be interpreted as veiled references to the missing Primarchs. The Chronicle described a cosmic struggle between forces of order and chaos that required the sacrifice of the firstborn of light to prevent the corruption of the divine plan. The text's references to brothers who walked into darkness and the empty thrones of heaven carried profound significance for readers who understood their true meaning. The theological implications of the missing Primarchs occupied a central position in word-bearers' doctrine even before their fall to chaos. Lorger's extensive writings on the nature of divine will and cosmic purpose contained numerous references to the necessity of sacrifice and loss in the pursuit of greater spiritual advancement. His theological framework suggested that the Emperor's ascension to godhood required the removal of elements that were too pure or too dangerous to survive the transformation, a process that demanded the sacrifice of those who were closest to the divine source. This theological interpretation of the missing Primarchs as necessary sacrifices, rather than failures, provided the word-bearers with a framework for understanding events that other legions found incomprehensible or disturbing. The 17th Legion scholars developed elaborate theories about the role of divine judgment in shaping the course of the Great Crusade, suggesting that the removal of certain elements was not punishment for failure, but recognition of their fundamental incompatibility with the Emperor's ultimate purpose. The Space Wolves, the Emperor's executioners. The Space Wolves occupied a unique position within the Emperor's military hierarchy that extended far beyond their role as one of the 18 Space Marine Legions. While other legions specialized in specific aspects of warfare, the Imperial Fists in fortification, the White Scars in rapid assault, the Iron Hands in mechanized warfare, the 6th Legion served a darker purpose that was known only to the highest echelons of Imperial command. Lemon Russ and his warriors functioned as the Emperor's ultimate sanction against threats that could not be addressed through conventional military means, including the terrifying possibility of having to act against their own Gene brothers. This role as the Emperor's executioner was not officially codified in any Imperial document, but it was understood by those who witnessed the Space Wolves' deployment patterns during the Great Crusade. Unlike other legions that were typically assigned to specific sectors or campaign theaters, the 6th Legion maintained a degree of operational independence that allowed them to respond rapidly to threats anywhere in the galaxy. Their fleet assets included specialized vessels designed for rapid deployment and sustained independent operations, capabilities that distinguished them from their more conventionally organized brothers. The Space Wolves' organizational structure reflected their unique mission parameters while maintaining the standard Legion hierarchy of chapters, companies, and squads. However, the 6th Legion also incorporated elements that were specifically designed for operations against other Astartes forces. Their Wolf Guard units possessed equipment and training that was optimized for combat against power-armored opponents, including specialized ammunition types and close combat weapons that could penetrate Astartes' protection systems. These modifications were subtle enough to avoid drawing attention from other legions, but significant enough to provide crucial advantages in fratricidal conflict. Lemon Russ himself embodied the contradictions inherent in his legion's dual nature. The Wolf King projected an image of straightforward barbarism that masked a sophisticated understanding of imperial politics and military strategy. His carefully cultivated persona as a simple warrior from a primitive world concealed the fact that he possessed one of the most analytically capable minds among the Primarchs. This deception was deliberate and necessary, as it allowed him to operate effectively in his role as the Emperor's hidden weapon, while maintaining the trust and camaraderie of his brothers. The Primarch's relationship with the Emperor differed subtly, but significantly from those of his BR. While other Primarchs received broad strategic directives and were expected to interpret them according to their own tactical preferences, Russ often received specific, detailed instructions that were delivered through secure channels unavailable to other Legion commanders. These communications frequently contained information about potential threats within the Imperial military structure, including assessments of his brother, Primarch's psychological stability, and loyalty indicators that would have been considered highly sensitive by normal standards. The Space Wolves' involvement in the censure of the Thunder Warriors during the Unification Wars had established their credentials as reliable executioners of the Emperor's will. The Sixth Legion's participation in the systematic elimination of the Thunder Warrior regiments demonstrated their willingness to carry out orders that other forces might have found morally problematic. This early demonstration of absolute loyalty and operational effectiveness had marked them as suitable for similar tasks that might arise during the Great Crusade. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, who would later become the oldest living space marine in the Imperium, possessed memories of campaigns during the Great Crusade that he guarded with extraordinary care. As one of Lemon Russ's most trusted lieutenants, Bjorn had participated in operations that were never officially recorded and witnessed events that were systematically erased from Imperial history. His ancient mind contained fragments of knowledge that could have illuminated the true fate of the missing legions, but his loyalty to his Primarch and the Emperor ensured that these secrets remained buried. The future Great Wolf's careful silence regarding certain campaigns during the Great Crusade was notable for its consistency and deliberate nature. When questioned about specific time periods or operational deployments, Bjorn would deflect inquiries with references to other, more publicly acceptable missions that the Space Wolves had undertaken during the same time frames. His responses were crafted with the skill of someone who had spent centuries practicing the art of concealment, revealing just enough information to satisfy curiosity while protecting the most sensitive details. Bjorn's memories of his Primarch during these dark periods revealed the psychological toll that the Wolf King's burden had exacted. The ancient warrior recalled instances when Lemon Russ would retreat to his private chambers for days at a time, emerging with a haunted expression that suggested he had been wrestling with decisions that challenged even his iron resolve. These periods of isolation typically followed the receipt of sealed orders from Terra, communications that were delivered by the most secure astropathic channels and destroyed immediately after being read. The Space Wolves who participated in these classified operations developed their own methods for coping with the psychological impact of their actions. The Legion's emphasis on brotherhood and pack loyalty provided a support structure that helped individual warriors process the moral complexities of their duties. However, the requirement for absolute secrecy meant that these support mechanisms had to operate within carefully defined boundaries that prevented the disclosure of operational details even to other members of the Legion. The Imperial Fist's reputation for methodical documentation and systematic record-keeping made them natural repositories for information that other legions might have handled more casually. Rogal Dorn's obsessive attention to detail had created an administrative system within the 7th Legion that tracked every aspect of their operations with unprecedented precision. Supply requisitions, personnel transfers, tactical assessments, and strategic planning documents were all maintained in carefully organized archives that could be accessed and cross-referenced with remarkable efficiency. This systematic approach to information management had made the Imperial Fists invaluable partners in joint operations with other legions, as their records could provide comprehensive overviews of complex multi-legion campaigns. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists approached record-keeping with the same methodical precision that he brought to fortress construction and siege warfare. Every document was cataloged according to multiple classification systems, with cross-references that allowed rapid retrieval of information based on date, personnel involved, operational parameters, or strategic significance. The archives within the Phalanx contained millions of documents that chronicled not only the Imperial Fist's own campaigns, but also detailed observations of their brother legions' activities during joint operations. This comprehensive documentation had created an invaluable resource for Imperial strategic planning and historical analysis. However, within this vast repository of meticulously maintained records Certain gaps appeared with such consistency that they could only have been deliberate. The Imperial Fist's campaign histories contained systematic omissions that corresponded to specific time periods during the early decades of the Great Crusade. These gaps were not random or accidental, but followed patterns that suggested careful editorial intervention. Documents that should have existed based on the Legion's normal record-keeping practices were simply absent, their absence marked only by sequential numbering systems that skipped certain entries without explanation. The most significant of these gaps occurred during the period when the Second and 11th Legions would have been most active in the Great Crusade. Imperial Fist's records from this era contained references to joint operations and strategic planning sessions that mentioned only 16 participating legions, despite the fact that the mathematical requirements of the campaigns described would have necessitated additional forces. Supply requisitions and logistical planning documents contained calculations that only made sense when accounting for military units that were not officially acknowledged to exist in the contemporary records. Rogal Dorn's personal communications with other Primarchs during this period revealed the careful language that had developed among the Emperor's sons when discussing sensitive subjects. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists had maintained extensive correspondence with his brothers throughout the Great Crusade, exchanging tactical assessments, strategic insights, and personal observations about the progress of humanity's expansion across the galaxy. These communications, preserved in encrypted archives within the Phalanx, contained numerous references to subjects that were never explicitly identified, but were clearly understood by all participants in the conversations. In one particularly revealing exchange with Ferrus Manus, Dorn had written extensively about the challenges of maintaining operational security during large-scale military campaigns. The letter contained detailed discussions of the procedures required to ensure that sensitive information remained compartmentalized, preventing unauthorized disclosure while maintaining the operational effectiveness of Imperial forces. The Primarch's observations about the necessity of sometimes sacrificing completeness for security provided insight into the mindset that had guided Imperial policy during the most sensitive periods of the Great Crusade. The Imperial Fist's role in the systematic erasure of the Lost Legions extended beyond simple record-keeping to encompass more active participation in the physical destruction of evidence. The 7th Legion's expertise in siege warfare and fortification made them natural choices for operations that required the complete destruction of heavily defended installations. Their specialized knowledge of structural engineering and demolition techniques would have been invaluable in ensuring that fortress monasteries and other Legion facilities were destroyed so thoroughly that no trace of their original purpose remained. Evidence of the Imperial Fist's involvement in these operations could be found in the careful gaps that appeared in their deployment records during specific periods of the Great Crusade. The Legion's normal operational patterns showed consistent deployment schedules and predictable rotation cycles that allowed for maintenance, resupply, and personnel replacement. However, during certain critical periods, entire companies of Imperial Fists would disappear from normal deployment schedules for extended periods. Their activities during these absences never officially documented or explained. The specialized equipment requisitions that appeared in Imperial Fist's records during these periods suggested operations that went far beyond normal siege warfare activities. Orders for exotic demolition charges, specialized cutting tools, and equipment designed for the systematic destruction of Astartes-grade fortifications indicated missions that required the complete obliteration of structures built to withstand the most extreme forms of assault. The quantities of materials requested suggested operations on a scale that would have been necessary to destroy entire fortress monastery complexes. The 13th Legion's expansion during the latter decades of the Great Crusade presented one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in Imperial military history. Yet it also raised questions that Imperial administrators preferred not to examine too closely. While other legions maintained relatively stable force levels throughout the campaign period, the Ultramarines experienced a period of unprecedented growth that transformed them from a substantial but unremarkable force into the largest single military formation in the Emperor's arsenal. This expansion occurred with such rapidity and efficiency that it defied conventional understanding of Space Marine recruitment and training protocols. Standard Space Marine creation procedures required extensive periods for candidate selection, genetic compatibility testing, surgical implantation of gene seed organs, and the psychological conditioning necessary to transform mortal humans into transhuman warriors. The process typically consumed several years per individual recruit, with significant attrition rates at every stage of development. Even the most efficient Legion recruitment programs could produce only limited numbers of new Space Marines annually, constrained by the availability of suitable candidates and the complex medical procedures required for successful transformation. The Ultramarines' recruitment statistics during the period immediately following the disappearance of the Second and 11th Legions showed dramatic increases that exceeded these normal parameters by substantial margins. Imperial records indicated that the 13th Legion had somehow managed to increase their recruitment efficiency by factors that should have been impossible given the established limitations of gene seed implantation technology. The mathematical impossibility of these figures suggested alternative explanations that were never officially acknowledged or investigated. Robert Guilliman's personal involvement in the expansion process demonstrated the same methodical precision that characterized all his military endeavors. The Primarch had implemented systematic reforms to Ultramarines' recruitment protocols that supposedly optimized every aspect of the selection and training process. His innovations included enhanced screening procedures that identified suitable candidates more efficiently, improved surgical techniques that reduced implantation failure rates, and accelerated conditioning programs that shortened the overall transformation timeline without compromising the quality of the resulting warriors. The theoretical improvements that Guilliman claimed to have developed were certainly impressive from an administrative perspective, but they could not account for the sheer scale of the Ultramarines' expansion. Even with perfect efficiency in every aspect of the recruitment process, the biological limitations of gene seed cultivation and implantation created absolute constraints that could not be overcome through organizational reforms alone. The 13th Legion's growth rates suggested access to resources or methods that were not available to other legions operating under the same theoretical constraints. Ultramar's extensive network of recruitment worlds provided the most commonly cited explanation for the Legion's rapid expansion. The 13th Legion maintained recruitment rights over dozens of worlds within their home sector, creating a vast population base from which suitable candidates could be drawn. These worlds had been carefully selected and developed to produce individuals with the physical and psychological characteristics that made them ideal candidates for Space Marine transformation. The systematic cultivation of these recruitment populations represented one of the most sophisticated human resource management programs in Imperial history. The efficiency of Ultramar's recruitment infrastructure was undeniable, but it still could not fully explain the dramatic surge in Ultramarines' numbers during the critical period. Other legions maintained similar recruitment networks across multiple star systems, yet none experienced comparable growth rates. The 13th Legion's expansion occurred with such consistency and predictability that it suggested access to pre-existing pools of trained personnel, rather than the gradual development of new recruits through normal processes. The integration of these new warriors into existing Ultramarines formations proceeded with remarkable smoothness. demonstrating organizational capabilities that exceeded even Guilliman's legendary administrative skills. Newly recruited Space Marines typically required extensive additional training and cultural indoctrination before they could be effectively integrated into established units. The process of creating functional squad-level cohesion and developing the tactical instincts necessary for effective combat operations normally consumed months or years of intensive preparation. The speed with which new Ultramarines achieved operational effectiveness suggested that many of these warriors possessed prior military experience that significantly reduced their integration requirements. The most compelling explanation for the Ultramarines' rapid expansion involved the systematic absorption of surviving personnel from the disbanded Second and 11th Legions. The warriors who had served in these lost formations possessed the advanced training, combat experience, and genetic modifications that would have made them ideal candidates for integration into existing Legion structures. Our prior service as Space Marines would have eliminated most of the lengthy preparation required for normal recruits, allowing them to be deployed operationally within relatively short time frames. The process of integrating former members of the Lost Legions into Ultramarines formations would have required extensive psychological conditioning and cultural reorientation. Warriors who had developed strong loyalties to their original Primarchs and Legion traditions would have needed careful handling to ensure their successful adaptation to new command structures and tactical doctrines. The 13th Legion's sophisticated training programs and emphasis on disciplined professionalism would have provided an ideal framework for managing this complex transition. Robert Guilliman's development of the Codex Astartes during this period served multiple purposes beyond its stated goal of standardizing Space Marine organization and tactics. The comprehensive nature of the document, which covered every aspect of Space Marine operations from squad-level tactics to fleet organization, provided a framework for integrating diverse military traditions into a unified system. The Codex's emphasis on standardization and systematic organization would have been particularly valuable for managing the cultural integration of warriors from different Legion backgrounds. The timing of the Codex Astartes development coincided precisely with the period of the Ultramarines' most rapid expansion, suggesting that the document was created at least partially in response to the practical challenges of managing such a diverse force. The systematic approach that Guilliman employed in developing the Codex reflected his understanding of the need to create unified doctrine and culture within a legion that had absorbed significant numbers of personnel from external sources. The document's comprehensive coverage of every aspect of Space Marine operations provided the institutional framework necessary to ensure consistent performance across all Legion formations. The psychological aspects of the Codex Astartes were equally important for managing the integration of former members of the Lost Legions. The document's emphasis on duty, honor, and service to the Emperor provided a unifying ideological framework that could supersede previous loyalties and allegiances. The systematic approach to indoctrination and cultural conditioning that the Codex prescribed would have been particularly valuable for ensuring that integrated personnel developed appropriate loyalty to their new Legion and Primarch. The weight of 10,000 years of human history pressed down upon Malcador the Sigillite's shoulders as he stood in the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, surrounded by archives that contained the most dangerous knowledge in the galaxy. As the Emperor's closest confidant and the architect of the Imperium's administrative machinery, Malcador alone among mortals possessed complete access to the secrets that shaped humanity's destiny. His role as the Regent of Terra during the Emperor's absence on the Great Crusade had granted him authority over information that could shatter the foundations of imperial civilization if it ever became public knowledge. The Sigillite's position as keeper of the Imperium's darkest secrets had evolved naturally from his unique relationship with the Emperor. Unlike the Primarchs, who were created to serve as military commanders and inspirational leaders. Malcador had been chosen for his analytical mind and absolute discretion. His psychic abilities, while formidable, were secondary to his capacity for understanding the complex political and strategic implications of the Emperor's grand design. The trust that the master of mankind placed in his ancient friend was absolute, extending to matters that were deemed too sensitive for even the Emperor's gene-forged sons. The administrative systems that Malcador had constructed to manage the Imperium's vast bureaucracy included specialized departments that existed solely to handle classified information. The Adeptus Administratum maintained separate archives for standard military records and sensitive intelligence that required the highest levels of security clearance. The organization employed thousands of scribes and data analysts who worked in compartmentalized sections, each one handling fragments of information that would be meaningless without access to the complete picture that only Malcador possessed. The Sigillites' private study within the palace's innermost sanctum contained files that documented every aspect of the Great Crusade's progress, including detailed assessments of each Primarch's psychological stability and loyalty indicators. These reports, compiled by teams of specially trained observers and analysts, provided comprehensive evaluations of the Emperor's sons that went far beyond their military capabilities. Malcador's files contained psychological profiles had analyzed each Primarch's potential vulnerabilities, emotional triggers, and the likelihood of future betrayal or corruption. The burden of maintaining such extensive surveillance networks while preserving the trust and cooperation of the Primarchs created constant tension within Malcador's daily responsibilities. The Sigillite understood that the Emperor's sons were not merely military assets, but individuals with complex personalities and emotional needs that required careful management. His role as intermediary between the Emperor and the Primarchs often involved delicate negotiations and psychological manipulation, designed to maintain harmony within the Imperial command structure, while gathering the intelligence necessary for long-term strategic planning. The most challenging aspect of Malcador's duties involved the systematic suppression of information regarding the Second and 11th Legions. The scope of this censorship operation exceeded anything previously attempted in human history, requiring the coordination of multiple Imperial departments and the deployment of specialized personnel trained in memory modification and data manipulation. The Sigillite personally oversaw every aspect of this massive undertaking, ensuring that no trace of the Lost Legions remained in official records while managing the psychological impact on those who had been involved in their erasure. The emotional toll of these responsibilities became apparent during a classified briefing session with senior administratum officials in the early decades of the 31st millennium. The meeting, held in a secure chamber deep within the palace's administrative complex, had been called to discuss the logistical challenges of maintaining the censorship protocols that concealed the fate of the missing legions. The officials present included some of the most trusted and experienced administrators in the Imperium, individuals who had been cleared for access to the most sensitive information available to mortal servants of the Emperor. As the discussion progressed through routine matters of record-keeping and data management, one of the senior scribes raised a question about the mathematical inconsistencies that appeared in certain strategic planning documents. The official noted that casualty projections and resource allocation models from the early Great Crusade contained calculations that seemed to account for military forces that were not reflected in contemporary organizational charts. The inquiry was presented as a technical matter, requiring clarification for accurate historical documentation. Malcador's response to this seemingly innocent question revealed the profound psychological strain that his duties had created. The Sigillites' normally composed demeanor cracked as he struggled to formulate an appropriate response that would satisfy the administrative requirements without violating the security protocols that govern discussion of the Lost Legions. His hands trembled as he reached for the classified files that contained the information necessary to address the inquiry, and his voice wavered as he began to explain the complex circumstances that had necessitated the systematic alteration of historical records. The assembled officials watched in stunned silence as the most powerful mortal in the Imperium broke down before their eyes. Malcador's carefully maintained facade of omniscient control dissolved as he described the burden of maintaining secrets that challenged his fundamental beliefs about truth and historical accuracy. The Sigilite's emotional breakdown was not merely a momentary lapse, but a profound expression of the psychological damage that years of enforced deception had inflicted upon his psyche. The techniques that Malcador employed to erase memories of the Second and 11th Legions from Imperial consciousness represented the most sophisticated application of psychic manipulation ever attempted on such a massive scale. The process required not only the identification and modification of specific memories, but also the careful reconstruction of alternative recollections that could fill the gaps left by the removed information. The Sigilite's psychic abilities allowed him to work directly with the neural pathways that stored memory, making precise alterations that would be undetectable to the subjects themselves. The memory modification procedures developed by Malcador involved multiple stages of psychic intervention, each one designed to address different aspects of the target's recollections. The initial phase focused on the identification and isolation of specific memories related to the Lost Legions, using psychic scanning techniques to locate the neural patterns that corresponded to these experiences. The second phase involved the careful extraction of these memories, removing them from the subject's consciousness while preserving the surrounding context that gave meaning to their other recollection. The most challenging aspect of the memory modification process was the creation of replacement memories that could seamlessly integrate with the subject's existing recollections. These artificial memories had to be constructed with extraordinary attention to detail, incorporating elements from the subject's actual experiences while eliminating any reference to the forbidden information. The process required Malcador to essentially rewrite portions of the subject's personal history, creating new narratives that maintained psychological continuity while serving the security requirements of the censorship operation. The scale of the memory modification program required the development of specialized psychic techniques that could be applied to large groups of individuals simultaneously. Malcador created psychic resonance fields that could affect hundreds of subjects at once, using his own consciousness as a template for the modifications that needed to be made. These mass memory alterations were typically conducted during large gatherings or ceremonial events, when the target population could be assembled in a single location without arousing suspicion. The physical and psychological toll of maintaining such massive psychic suppressions placed enormous strain on Malcador's already formidable but aging abilities. Each memory modification session required the Sigilite to extend his consciousness across multiple subjects while maintaining precise control over the alterations being made. The process was exhausting even for someone of Malcador's exceptional psychic strength, and the cumulative effect of years of such operations had begun to show in his increasingly frail physical condition. Theories of the Lost, what befell them? The systematic erasure of the Second and 11th Legions from Imperial records has created a vacuum of knowledge that scholars and theorists have attempted to fill through careful analysis of circumstantial evidence and logical deduction. The very thoroughness of their removal from history suggests that whatever fate befell these lost sons of the Emperor was deemed so catastrophic that even acknowledging their existence posed an unacceptable risk to Imperial stability. The most compelling theories regarding their disappearance center on fundamental failures that struck at the heart of the Primarch project itself, flaws so severe that they required the complete obliteration of their legacy from human memory. The genetic instability theory represents one of the most scientifically plausible explanations for the disappearance of the Lost Primarchs. The Emperor's creation of the 20 Primarchs involved genetic manipulation on a scale that pushed the boundaries of even his advanced understanding of biological science. Each Primarch was designed to embody specific aspects of human potential, magnified to superhuman levels through the incorporation of the Emperor's own genetic material and psychic essence. The complexity of these modifications created numerous opportunities for catastrophic failure, particularly in the areas of genetic stability and cellular integrity. The accelerated growth and development that characterized Primarch physiology placed enormous strain on their cellular structures and organ systems. Unlike normal human development, which occurs over decades and allows for gradual adaptation to biological changes, the Primarchs experienced rapid maturation that compressed normal developmental processes into a fraction of their usual time frame. This acceleration created conditions where genetic defects or instabilities that might have been manageable in normal human development could manifest as catastrophic failures in the Primarch template. Evidence for genetic instability in the Lost Primarchs can be inferred from the careful monitoring and medical protocols that were established for their surviving brothers. The extensive medical facilities maintained within each legion's fortress monastery included specialized equipment for monitoring genetic stability and detecting early signs of cellular degeneration. The presence of these monitoring systems suggests that the Emperor and his medical staff were aware of the potential for genetic failure and had implemented safeguards to detect and address such problems before they became critical. The gene seed derived from the Lost Primarchs would have carried any genetic instabilities present in their progenitors, potentially creating cascading failures throughout their respective legions. Space Marines created from unstable gene seed would have exhibited increasing rates of implant rejection, organ failure, and cellular degeneration, as the flaws in their genetic template became more pronounced over time. The systematic nature of such failures would have made it impossible to maintain effective fighting forces, ultimately requiring the dissolution of the affected legions. The ideological conflict theory suggests that one or both of Lost Primarchs developed philosophical or religious beliefs that were fundamentally incompatible with the Emperor's vision of imperial truth. The Emperor's secular ideology rejected all forms of religious worship and supernatural belief, viewing such concepts as obstacles to human progress and unity. A Primarch who embraced religious or mystical philosophies would have represented a direct challenge to the foundational principles of imperial civilization, creating an ideological crisis that could not be resolved through normal political or military means. The development of such ideological conflicts would have been particularly dangerous because of the Primarchs' role as inspirational leaders and cultural exemplars for their legions. Space Marines were designed to be absolutely loyal to their Primarch, following their genetic father's example in all matters of conduct and belief. A Primarch who embraced forbidden ideologies would have inevitably influenced their entire legion, creating tens of thousands of warriors whose beliefs were fundamentally opposed to imperial doctrine. Premature chaos corruption. The premature corruption theory proposes that one or both of the Lost Primarchs fell to chaos influence during their early development, either while still in their gestation pods or during their formative years on their adoptive worlds. The Chaos Gods possessed both the motivation and capability to corrupt the Emperor's sons, viewing them as the greatest threat to their eternal schemes of manipulation and destruction. The scattering of the infant Primarchs through the warp had provided the Dark Gods with unprecedented access to these developing demigods, creating opportunities for corruption that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The vulnerability of the Primarchs to chaos corruption during their early development stemmed from their incomplete psychological and spiritual formation. Unlike their adult selves, who possessed the mental discipline and moral framework necessary to resist supernatural temptation, the infant Primarchs were essentially blank slates that could be shaped by whatever influences they encountered during their formative years. Chaos corruption introduced during this critical period would have become integral to their fundamental nature, making it virtually impossible to detect or correct through normal means. The Xenos influence theory suggests that one or both of the Lost Primarchs encountered alien civilizations during their formative years that fundamentally altered their development and worldview. The galaxy contained numerous Xeno species with advanced psychological manipulation capabilities, including races that could influence human development through subtle mental conditioning or biological modification. A Primarch exposed to such influences during their critical developmental period might have been transformed into something that retained human appearance while serving alien interests. Active rebellion. The rebellion theory proposes that one or both of the Lost Primarchs actively opposed the Emperor's authority, either through direct military action or through the systematic subversion of imperial institutions. Unlike the ideological conflicts that might have been resolved through negotiation or re-education, active rebellion would have required immediate and decisive military response. The scale of such conflicts would have been unprecedented, pitting Space Marine against Space Marine in fratricidal warfare that foreshadowed the later Horus Heresy. The causes of such rebellion could have been numerous and complex, ranging from personal grievances against the Emperor's leadership to fundamental disagreements about the direction of the Great Crusade. A Primarch who believed that the Emperor's methods were too harsh, or that humanity's expansion should follow different principles, might have felt compelled to oppose imperial policy through direct action. The absolute nature of Space Marine loyalty would have made it impossible for such conflicts to remain limited to political disagreement, inevitably escalating to open warfare. The Rangdan Xenocides, a campaign of extinction. The Rangdan Xenocides represent one of the most catastrophic and deliberately obscured conflicts of the Great Crusade, a series of campaigns so devastating that they nearly brought humanity's expansion to a complete halt. These wars, fought against an alien species whose very nature was deemed too dangerous to record in detail, consumed vast imperial resources and resulted in casualties that dwarfed most other conflicts of the era. The systematic suppression of information regarding these campaigns has created gaps in imperial historical records that rival even the censorship surrounding the Lost Primarchs, suggesting connections between these two great mysteries of the 30th millennium. The Rangdan themselves represented a form of Xeno's threat that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of alien life and the security of human civilization. Unlike the more comprehensible threats posed by Orc empires or Eldar craft worlds, the Rangdan appeared to possess capabilities that transcended normal understanding of biological and technological development. Their ability to corrupt and subvert human populations through methods that remained poorly understood made them particularly dangerous to imperial forces, as conventional military responses proved inadequate against enemies who could turn humanity's own strengths against itself. The first encounters with Rangdan forces occurred during the early decades of the Great Crusade, when imperial expeditionary fleets pushing into the galactic north encountered resistance that defied standard tactical analysis. Initial reports described alien warriors whose equipment and capabilities seemed to shift and adapt in response to imperial tactics, creating battlefield conditions where established military doctrine proved ineffective. The psychological impact on imperial forces was severe, as soldiers accustomed to clear tactical parameters found themselves facing enemies whose very nature seemed to violate the laws of physics and biology. The Dark Angels bore the brunt of the initial Rangdan encounters, their position as the first legion making them the natural choice for spearheading humanity's expansion into the most dangerous sectors of the galaxy. Lion El'Janson's tactical genius and his legion's disciplined approach to warfare made them ideally suited for conflicts that required both military excellence and absolute discretion. The Dark Angels' secretive nature, already established through their origins on Caliban, and their Primarchs' reserved personality, provided the perfect cover for operations that required the highest levels of operational security. The losses sustained by the Dark Angels during the Rangdan Xenocides were catastrophic by any measure, reducing one of the largest and most capable legions to a fraction of its original strength. Entire chapters of Dark Angels were lost during these campaigns, their gene seed and battle honors disappearing into the void of censored history. The First Legion's recruitment worlds were stripped of their populations, as the demand for replacement warriors exceeded even their considerable capacity for producing new Space Marines. The psychological impact on surviving Dark Angels was profound, creating a culture of secrecy and paranoia that would define the Legion for millennia to come. The Emperor's personal involvement in the Rangdan Xenocides marked one of the few occasions during the Great Crusade when the Master of Mankind felt compelled to take direct command of military operations. His presence on the battlefield demonstrated the severity of the threat posed by the Rangdan, as the Emperor typically delegated tactical command to his Primarchs, while focusing on the broader strategic objectives of human expansion. The psychic energies that the Emperor unleashed during these campaigns were reportedly visible from orbit, creating phenomena that required careful explanation to prevent panic among Imperial forces. The Lost Legions and the Rangdan connection. The Second and 11th Legions' potential involvement in the Rangdan Xenocides provides one of the most compelling explanations for their disappearance from Imperial records. The nature of the Rangdan threat, with its emphasis on corruption and subversion of human forces, created conditions where entire military units could be compromised beyond any possibility of recovery. Legions that encountered certain forms of Rangdan influence might have been transformed into something so fundamentally alien that their continued existence posed an unacceptable threat to Imperial security. The timeline of the Rangdan Xenocides corresponds closely with the period when references to the Lost Legions disappear from Imperial records. The systematic nature of this censorship suggests that their fate was connected to events that were deemed too dangerous to acknowledge even in the classified archives maintained by the highest levels of Imperial administration. The resources required to completely erase two entire legions from history would have been justified only by threats that exceeded normal parameters of military or political crisis. The corruption vectors employed by Rangdan forces appeared to target the fundamental aspects of human identity and loyalty that made Space Marines effective warriors. Unlike chaos corruption, which typically manifested as obvious physical or psychological changes, Rangdan influence seemed to operate at levels that were virtually undetectable until the transformation was complete. Space Marines who had been exposed to certain forms of Rangdan technology or biological agents might have appeared normal while gradually becoming something entirely different from their original nature. The gene seed implications of Rangdan corruption presented particularly severe challenges for Imperial military planners. If the alien influence could affect the genetic material that formed the foundation of Space Marine biology, entire legions could have been compromised at the most fundamental level. The systematic destruction of affected gene seed stocks would have required the dissolution of any legion whose genetic heritage had been tainted, regardless of the loyalty or effectiveness of individual warriors who had not yet been directly affected. Survivors in the shadows, the Black Shields. The systematic erasure of the Second and 11th Legions from Imperial records could never be completely absolute, despite the extraordinary resources and psychic manipulation deployed to achieve total censorship. The sheer scale of the Great Crusade, with its thousands of worlds and millions of personnel, created countless opportunities for fragments of information to survive in overlooked archives, personal journals, and the memories of individuals who escaped the purges. These surviving traces have fueled persistent rumors throughout Imperial history about scattered remnants of the Lost Legions, warriors who somehow survived the catastrophe that befell their brothers and continued to operate in the shadows of the galaxy. The mathematical impossibility of accounting for every single Space Marine who had served in the Second and 11th Legions created inevitable gaps in the censorship efforts. Standard Legion strength during the early Great Crusade ranged from 80,000 to 120,000 warriors, organized into companies and chapters that were frequently deployed across multiple star systems simultaneously. The distributed nature of these deployments meant that, when the order came to eliminate all traces of the Lost Legions, some elements would have been operating in remote sectors where communication delays and the chaos of ongoing campaigns could have provided opportunities for escape or concealment. Reconnaissance companies and deep strike forces represented the most likely candidates for survival, as these specialized units operated with high degrees of independence and were often deployed far from their parent legions for extended periods. The Second Legion's theoretical emphasis on rapid assault operations would have necessitated the deployment of numerous small unit formations across wide areas of space, making it virtually impossible to track and eliminate every warrior simultaneously. Similarly, the 11th Legion's focus on siege warfare would have required the establishment of garrison forces and fortification specialists on conquered worlds, creating dispersed populations that could not be easily located and eliminated. The Black Shield phenomenon during the Horus Heresy provided a convenient explanation for the presence of Space Marines whose origins could not be easily traced or verified. These warriors, who had abandoned their Legion heraldry and identification markings, operated as independent mercenary forces that sold their services to various factions during the Civil War. The chaos and confusion of the heresy created ideal conditions for survivors of the Lost Legions to blend into the general population of renegade Space Marines, adopting new identities and allegiances that obscured their true origins. The organizational structure of Black Shield companies during the heresy showed suspicious similarities to the theoretical tactical doctrines that had been attributed to the Lost Legions. Several documented Black Shield formations demonstrated expertise in rapid assault techniques that exceeded the capabilities typically associated with standard Legion training programs. These units employed specialized equipment and tactical approaches that suggested access to knowledge and resources that were not available to other renegade forces. The precision with which these formations executed complex operations indicated levels of training and experience that could only have been acquired through extended service in elite military units. Archaeological evidence. Archaeological evidence from worlds that had been conquered during the early Great Crusade has revealed fortifications and equipment caches that cannot be attributed to any of the known legions. These installations demonstrate construction techniques and defensive philosophies that were distinct from the documented approaches employed by the 18 surviving legions. The sophistication of these fortifications, which incorporated advanced engineering principles and defensive technologies, indicated that they had been constructed by forces with access to specialized knowledge and resources that were not available to standard Imperial military units. The architectural analysis of these mysterious fortifications revealed design elements that were consistent with the theoretical specializations of the Lost Legions. Defensive installations that emphasized rapid deployment and mobility showed characteristics that aligned with the supposed tactical doctrines of the Second Legion. Conversely, permanent fortifications that demonstrated advanced siege warfare principles bore resemblances to the theoretical approaches that had been attributed to the 11th Legion. The consistency of these architectural elements across multiple worlds suggested that they had been constructed according to standardized design principles that had been developed by organized military forces rather than ad hoc defensive efforts. The discovery of gene seed repositories within some of these installations provided the most compelling evidence for the continued existence of Lost Legion remnants. These repositories contained genetic material that bore characteristics consistent with Primarch gene lines, but could not be matched to any of the known 18 legions. The sophisticated preservation techniques employed in these repositories indicated that they had been established by forces with access to advanced biological and medical technologies. The systematic organization of these genetic archives suggested that they had been intended to support ongoing recruitment and training programs rather than serving as simple storage facilities. The deliberate preservation of the Lost Primarchs as an eternal mystery represents one of Games Workshop's most sophisticated narrative decisions, demonstrating a profound understanding of how absence can be more powerful than presence in fictional universes. The company's conscious choice to leave the Second and 11th Legions undefined serves multiple creative purposes that extend far beyond simple marketing considerations or narrative convenience. This decision reflects a mature recognition that some mysteries become more compelling when they remain unsolved, creating spaces within the established lore where imagination can flourish without contradicting established canon. The creative philosophy behind maintaining the Lost Primarchs as undefined entities stems from Games Workshop's understanding that the Warhammer 40,000 universe functions most effectively when it provides frameworks for player creativity rather than exhaustive documentation of every historical detail. The gaps left by the missing legions create opportunities for hobbyists to develop their own interpretations and theories without violating established lore. This approach acknowledges that the universe belongs as much to the players who inhabit it through their games and models, as it does to the writers who create its official narratives. The psychological impact of the unknown has been carefully cultivated through decades of subtle references and deliberate omissions that maintain the mystery's presence without revealing its nature. The surviving Primarchs' reluctance to discuss their lost brothers creates an atmosphere of unspoken dread that permeates every gathering of the Emperor's sons. When Horus speaks with his brothers about the future of the Great Crusade, the empty spaces at their councils serve as constant reminders of failure and loss. The careful positioning of these absences in key narrative moments ensures that readers remain aware of the mystery without becoming frustrated by its lack of resolution. The narrative function of the Lost Legions extends beyond simple mystery mongering to serve as a fundamental reminder of the Emperor's fallibility and the hidden costs of his grand design. In a universe where the master of mankind is often portrayed as an omniscient architect of human destiny, the existence of failures so catastrophic that they required complete erasure from history provides crucial balance to his characterization. The Lost Primarchs represent proof that even the Emperor's most carefully crafted plans could go catastrophically wrong, humanizing a figure who might otherwise seem too perfect to be compelling. The grim darkness of the Warhammer 40,000 universe is fundamentally enhanced by the presence of mysteries that will never be fully resolved. The Lost Primarchs represent the ultimate expression of this philosophy, embodying the concept that some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve and that some failures are too catastrophic to acknowledge. Their absence from the historical record serves as a constant reminder that the Imperium's official narratives are incomplete and that the true cost of humanity's expansion across the galaxy was far higher than most citizens could comprehend. The enduring questions surrounding the Lost Primarchs will likely never receive official answers, and this deliberate ambiguity serves the narrative far better than any specific revelation could. The mystery's power lies not in its eventual resolution, but in its permanent presence as a reminder of the Emperor's fallibility and the hidden costs of the Great Crusade. The careful cultivation of this uncertainty over decades of publications has created one of the most effective examples of negative space. In science fiction literature, where what is absent becomes more significant than what is present. In this way, the Lost Primarchs achieve their ultimate narrative purpose. They embody the fundamental tragedy of the Imperium, where the pursuit of human unity and progress demands sacrifices so terrible that they cannot be acknowledged, and where the greatest victories are built upon foundations of loss and failure that must remain forever hidden. The mystery of the Second and 11th Legions will endure as long as the Warhammer 40,000 universe itself, serving as an eternal reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, some truths are too dangerous to remember, and some brothers are too lost to mourn.